Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today about the World Trade Organization and mandatory country of origin labeling. I'm Rhonda Perry. I'm the Executive Director of the Missouri Rural Crisis Center, and I'll be facilitating our conversation today. First, I want to flip over to a few housekeeping items, and then I will introduce the webinar and our esteemed panelists. First of all, the webinar will be recorded and will be available for attendees. We'll be accepting questions throughout the webinar in the Q&A section, which is down at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible today. We are going to be conscious of time and ending on time because I know people have very busy schedules and busy lives. And we appreciate you spending time with us. And please stay with us till the end. At the end, we will have a screen and a slide and a short conversation about what we can do to work together to win the labeling policies we know we need for farmers and consumers. And with that, I will introduce our webinar today. Thank you again for attending. Welcome to the webinar, Truth in Labeling, Cool, the WTO, and the Way Forward. I'm Rhonda Perry. I'm a fifth-generation Missouri livestock and grain farmer and the executive director of the Missouri Rural Crisis Center. I will be the moderator for today's discussion. We have a great panel lined up for you all today, folks who are really experts in their field of farm policy, trade, farming, and ranching. And they are here today to help us really understand the case for mandatory country of origin labeling, why it matters for farmers and consumers, and why Congress should stop using the WTO and the WTO ruling as a logical excuse to not implement country of origin labeling. With that, I would like to introduce our panel. First up, we have Gilles Stockton, who is a cattle rancher and sheep farmer from Grass Range, Montana. He's a member of Northern Plains Resource Council and the Western Organization of Resource Councils. We have our own Tim Gibbons from the Missouri Rural Crisis Center, who's the communications director and who has been working for nearly 20 years on federal farm and trade policy. And last but certainly not least, we are joined by Chuck Benoit, who is trade counsel for the Coalition for a Prosperous America. He is an experienced trade attorney who has represented clients on international trade issues in federal court and before the United States International Trade Commission, as well as advocating for trade enforcement before the USTR. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to our panel. With that, I will turn it over to Gilles to fill us in specifically about why mandatory country of origin labeling matters to farmers and ranchers.
Yeah. Well, as everybody should know, probably don't, in 2015, Congress specifically removed beef from the mandatory labeling requirements. Cattle prices immediately collapsed. I and my neighbors got $1 less per pound than we had the year before. And for the next 7 years, cattle prices trended even lower. Not only did this hurt me, but it hurted everybody in the state of Montana and the rural West. Our rural economy in Montana took a hit of nearly $1 billion per year. And then while the cattle prices collapsed, retail beef prices trended even higher, as did beef and cattle imports. Rescinding COOL, what it did was allow for low-quality South American beef to sell as though it came from my cattle, which incidentally, qualify for certified Angus beef label. It was all calculated consumer fraud and theft. And it was our own Congress that did it to us. The bottom line is that consumers have the right to know the origin of their food purchases. And cattle ranchers like me should have a fair and honest market. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jill. I think there will be time for some Q&A at the end. So if folks have specific questions they are thinking about related to the impact of coal on farmers, you'll be prepared to answer those with us. So thank you so much. I think this is a place that we sometimes gets overlooked related to coal and its relationship specifically to farmers. And now Tim is going to provide us with an overview and a little bit of the history and precedent that was set with the passage and then the taking away of country of origin labeling by Congress. Tim?
Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you, Gio. Thank you, Charles, for being here. And thank you, everybody, for attending this important webinar about a policy that's pretty much common sense in my brain. Common sense, I think, in the vast majority of Americans' brains. Right quick, Missouri Rural Crisis Center is a statewide farm and rural membership organization. We started in 1985. Out of the farm crisis, we listened to our members first. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is what I've learned from our members who raise cattle. Missouri is second only to Texas in number of cattle operations. One thing that we know is that the current status of the livestock industry and the cattle industry in particular is not because it's inevitable. It's specifically because of history and because of policy. That's one thing that we know here at MRCC, and coming out of the 80s farm crisis, we know that intimately. Why is cool important? And there's so many reasons why country of origin labeling is important. I'm just going to give you 4 quick tidbits. One is consumers and producers both overwhelmingly support country of origin labeling and transparency on knowing where their meat comes from. I was on the Hill in a Hill meeting in a congressional office, and one of the staffers said, well, country of origin labeling is pretty controversial. And, I stepped back right quick and said, hey, it may be controversial among lobbyists on Capitol Hill, but out here in rural Missouri and rural America, in all of America, urban and rural both, the vast majority of people believe that they should be able to not only know where their meat comes from, but choose beef that is born, raised, and harvested here in the United States. So that's number one. Number two, and what corporate agribusiness doesn't want to tell us and doesn't really want us to know, in 2023, the United States imported 3.7 billion pounds of boxed beef and 2 million live cattle. Let me say that again, 3.7 billion pounds of boxed beef and 2 million live cattle. To think that the 4 meat packers that control 85% of the U.S. beef market don't use those imports to manipulate prices, both paying producers less and making consumers pay more, doesn't make any sense. I was born at night, but I wasn't born last night, and that's what they jam into our heads. So imports are an important factor here. Number 3, like Jill said, there's precedent. This passed in the 2002 Farm Bill and the 2008 Farm Bill. And we'll get into why it got rescinded because of an unaccountable bureaucratic pro-corporate board. But there is precedent here. So this isn't just a newfangled idea that we're coming up with now. And last but not least, and we don't hear as much about this as we should, the 2022 census was just released. And that comes out about every 5 years. And the United States lost 150,000 cattle producers in that 5 years. It doesn't include 2023, which was a huge liquidation year as well. So I fear that 2023 made it even more drastic. And Missouri lost 20% of our cattle operations in 5 years. We went from just over 50,000 to just over 40,000. So these are big questions, not only about consumers' ability to know where our meat comes from, but also the ability of independent cattle producers to stay on the land, pass the farm down to next generations. Who's going to own this land in the future? We think that it should be in the hands of independent family farmers. And in order for that to happen, we need fair, open, and competitive markets. And country of origin labeling is an integral part to that. So I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you again for listening. And I hope to be able to answer any questions on this webinar. But if you need anything after this webinar, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at MRCC or any of us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tim. This is a really good background to lead us into our conversation with Chuck, and I really appreciate you joining us. I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about what do you do. I just described your bio a little bit, and there are a lot of letters and a lot of big words that people may not be familiar with in terms of trade. So if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit of an introduction to yourself and to what the WTO, we sort of bandy that around a little bit, but what the World Trade Organization actually is.
Yeah, thanks, Rhonda, and thank you, everyone. Tim, great comments and skills. So, my name is Charles Benoit. I'm trade counsel for the Coalition for a Prosperous America. We're a nonprofit national organization representing producers, agricultural and manufacturing. We say we're the only national organization that exclusively represents people who make things here across manufacturing. So that's a bit of a CPA. My own background is I started out very much in the WTO compliance world. Graduated Georgetown Law in 2010. They had a whole Institute for International Economic Law with really the father of the WTO. The people who helped come up with all of the laws were there. The WTO law is very much DC and Geneva as the two cities. Well, I interned at the Canadian Embassy. I'm a dual citizen with Canada during law school in the trade section. So wrong team here on this issue. And then was very fortunate to start up my career at General Electric. Worked with the European Union as one of their 3 American lawyers for the US-EU FTA negotiations. So most of my career was advising organizations, groups, governments on WTO compliance. But I saw all the problems in the rules, and I'm thrilled that now most of my time is not spent doing WTO compliance, because I've been able to pivot with the broader shift in the politics and the paradigm in DC to helping draft legislation and relief that is done regardless of WTO rules. So just we've seen a lot of success in new tariff bills coming out in this Congress, which is not something that's happened in almost 90 years. So that's a bit about me. You asked as well about the WTO, so I can jump into that. The way to think about the WTO is the WTO is just a building, okay? It's a building, it's an organization that supervises a lot of different agreements that you can kind of think of as like a constitution. So everything I'm about to tell you, it's all really bad, but I don't want you to lose sight that ranchers have had it almost the worst. Okay, I've dealt with so many industries, and ranchers have really had it the worst. You've been probably arguably the biggest victim in America of this global system. But so there's one key agreement. You might have already heard of it, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. You'll read all the time that this is like some sort of predecessor or it's gone. No. The GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, that is the global economic constitution that has governed our economy and the free economies of the world since 1947. It was part of the whole Bretton Woods post-World War II makeup. What happened in the 1990s was the GATT was actually being kind of administered by staff on loan from the United Nations. So that finally, all the countries got together and they're like, okay, let's fund their own building, their own office. So they got that. Not really too important. There's some other things that happened with marrying IP that's not relevant to you all. And then what is relevant to you is a lot of the provisions of the GATT were filled out, like expanded and given more detail with a few dozen new agreements that really informed it. So think of the GATT as a constitution. You've got Article 1, it's all Roman numerals. That's the most favored nation principle. Article 3, the national treatment principle, very relevant for you all. And these were, all these, like just like the Constitution, they'd be, a handful of paragraphs. With the WTO in the 90s, they filled it out. So a lot of those Roman numeral articles got their entire agreements elaborating on how they should be implemented. So that's what happened in the 90s. And sorry, I'm very conscious of like fire hosing. I'll pause right there. I don't know.
So so we got this WTO greatly expanded, much more into our lives and very set up to impact our lives in ways that we didn't even know about at that point in time. And you've just heard from both Gilles and Tim the history of cool, and they've laid that out very well. I'm wondering, like, one of the things we hear all the time for why we can't have cool is the WTO ruling.
Yeah.
What exactly did the WTO say about country of origin labeling for meat?
Right. So I mentioned that one of the key principles of the GATT was national treatment. And one of the new agreements that came out in the WTO that was meant to inform national treatment a lot was something called the Technical Barriers to Trade, TBT agreement. So the idea of national treatment is, if you ever wondered why, like, why wouldn't Michigan have a lower fee if you registered a car made in America versus an imported car? Right. And you don't see that anywhere in the world. And this may surprise you. I mean, but this all goes back to national treatment. And that national treatment is the idea that once you import a product, it should, and the importer pays the tariff, right? Tariffs used to be our primary source of revenue. So going back to the 1700s, 1800s, governments were very like, okay, if an importer's paid their tariff, then once it's in, it should be treated no less favorably than the equivalent domestic product. So national treatment actually is like an ancient principle. Benjamin Franklin went in our first treaty with France. We gave them national treatment. So national treatment's not a bad idea. And the idea is we should be doing our protection at the borders. It's much more efficient. Keep the internal market dynamic and fluid. So national treatment's not terribly controversial, but we've actually now thrown it out, but I'll get to that. So what happened with country of origin labeling is, you were very unfortunate to go up against multinational processors, which are not just dominant here, also dominant in Canada and Mexico. And to them, this is going to increase their costs. The cool law will increase their costs. And they had no problem. Most governments are very transactional, especially in the West. And so they had no problem going to Canada and saying, you need to challenge this. They challenged it domestically as well, lost in U.S. courts. But they convinced Canada and Mexico to bring a WTO lawsuit. And ultimately, there was a bunch of, I hesitate to get in so much into it, but we can. But they nitpicked a bunch of things that said ultimately the cool law treats imported beef less favorably than American beef, and for that reason it violates the TBT. The top level, one of the things that this was a really one of the worst decisions was they got away from de jure analysis. So that I gave the example of if Michigan just said we're gonna we're gonna double the registration fee for imported cars. I mean, that's just discriminatory on its face, and that's the kind of thing that would have been struck down. But here now we're getting into country of origin labeling has always been legitimate. It's been part of the customs law since before GATT and through GATT. GATT recognizes it as a legitimate goal. So they were ignoring all of that, and they got into this de facto analysis. Well, it's like, no, the laws don't intend to discriminate on imports. I mean, Japanese beef's very popular. There's nothing that taxes imported beef at more, but one of the main things that through the various iterations of the rule and the decisions that kept coming up was the cost to segregate the livestock. Like, well, we have to keep it segregated then. But this was controversial too. The meat packers were giving them confidential business information, CBI. But the U.S. criticized that as black box data. The meat packers had every incentive to say, "Oh yeah, this is going to cost us $60 more a head," the WTO panel should not have accepted that, but they did, and And so, yeah, ultimately, because of the heightened cost, that they use that pretext to say that it would violate the WTO. So yeah, that one of the examples. I'll get into why I think the ranchers are why you've been uniquely punished under the system, and then I'll pause for questions again. So 2014, we also lost a WTO case for our cotton producers, and that was one that Brazil had bought. And on that one, so just as um, ranchers lost the MCOL decision, we lost the upland cotton dispute, and we just paid off Brazil $300 million. We just $300 million. Just let us keep on handing out these subsidies. It's like, okay. So even at the time, it was you got a raw deal. It's very rare. What Congress did, rapidly striking down the law, was very rare. We had major WTO disputes with Europe on Boeing Airbus. I mean, the litigation that it actually just 2021 finally wrapped. It's settled, but that was almost 20 years of litigation of the U.S. Not accepting and fighting, taking retaliatory tariffs. U.S. and Europe both imposed retaliatory tariffs against each other. So that was another option. We know we didn't have to take it lying down, especially with Canada and Mexico. They're way more dependent on our market than theirs. But you weren't completely thrown under the bus, mostly, but not completely. So Obama, for what they were so unhappy about this decision and two others that from the WTO appellate body that they actually withheld the nomination of a non-US judge to the appellate body. That was a first. And so that was kind of a big deal at the time, when everyone was now we're so far past that, but so that was a big deal. Good, that was something that the Obama administration did. Trump gets elected. The policy of blocking appellate body judges continues. Ambassador Lighthizer is actively hostile, and he came out in 2020. He came out with this massive report, February 2020, I believe, that documented all of the abuses, cited the WTO's appellate body decision and how it was a perverse interpretation of national treatment, the MCOL decision, pardon me, and how it would, this has stopped countries from pursuing all these legitimate objectives. So, the WTO is on notice as to why they no longer have an appellate body, and it's the MCOL decision was a consequential part of that. And Congress even kind of picked that up in a joint resolution. They adopted all these appellate body concerns. So that's a lot of ammo. And now the Biden administration is still there's no more WTO appellate body. The Biden administration has continued that policy that started under Obama, maintained through Trump. So congratulations. You were our you died on the cross for everyone else. You were so badly victimized that you destroyed the appellate body. So that's the big thing. And then just that's okay. So with the appellate body was destroyed, big deal. But now in the last few years, I mean, we are so far past caring about what the WTO or the GATT. We are so far past caring what GATT rules have to say about anything. So a lot of things broke it. I mean, China and Russia joined the WTO. That was probably a death sentence to that organization. We're in an ongoing violation because we no longer, for our China tariffs, those are WTO inconsistent. WTO has said as much. We don't care. Same with Russia. And then likewise, Trump did those steel and aluminum tariffs. WTO inconsistent. We don't care. And then the Inflation Reduction Act. I've got a long 4,000-word article in the American Affairs I'll plug, but on why that was really Congress rejecting the GATT, wholeheartedly like it never had before. But a big feature of that is if you buy an electric vehicle, you get a $7,500 tax credit, but the vehicle has to be assembled in North America. Europe, Asia, Asian imports, they don't get the credit. It's the Section 30D credit. So that's crazy. I never thought Congress would pass something like that. National treatment, as I said, that's something we've Congress has never since 1789 done something that so blatantly violates national treatment like that. And now we're in a world where you walk into a car dealership, and you walk into a Volkswagen dealership and you say, "Oh, is this one of those ID4s? Is it imported from Europe or is it the one made in Chattanooga? I need to know if I'm going to get the credit." So, I mean, I never thought that would happen, and it has. And it doesn't get a more blatant national treatment violation. I mean, it makes what the WTO appellate body reasoned on beef. It looks so ridiculous. So, yeah, that was a lot.
That's a lot. That's just
Yeah.
super, like, wow. It feels in a way like we were sort of on the front end of like lots of things that have happened to question and call into account why that was a bad decision, but also sort of trying to mitigate that in other arenas, which makes me ask, I always have a couple minutes before we move into the overall Q&A, but it seems like this is the time, like, to the bottom line response to people who are still saying we can't have cool because of the WTO. I mean, is that right? It sounds wrong because there are so many other things, so many other examples that you've provided of situations in which we have opted to make a different choice. So I'm wondering, just bottom line, is that a viable excuse? And we can talk a little bit more with other panelists too about how we can talk about that with just everyday people. But is that the bottom line? Like,
Yeah,
is it viable?
No, it's not an acceptable excuse whatsoever. The WTO appellate body's gone. USMCA, we still have disputes on, but the era of retaliation is over. We just, well, not just, about maybe a year and a half ago, time's a blur, but lost a USMCA dispute brought by Canada and Mexico on auto parts, and but we lost, and we just basically told them to pound sand, and there's no retaliation, and there's not going to be any more retaliation because we're the world's dumping ground, and that's what Lighthizer and President Trump articulated perfectly, and Ambassador Tai, current USTR, says the same thing. She has a quote about, our superpower is the fact that we're the only country willing to accept every other country's overcapacity. Everyone gets to dump on the U.S. free, and so you can't, when the relationships are so asymmetrical. You can't, no one can retaliate against us anymore because where we've shown that if you do, we're going to make it worse for you, and we have the leverage to do so. So no, this is really just it's a pretext. If they say WTO, they're saying we're choosing the meat packers over you, and if they say that's not right, you can say, well, okay, then you're choosing. What about cotton? What about automotive? What about all these other industries where we lost the decision and we just didn't comply?
This is sort of astounding because it feels like we've been talking about cool for so long, but to actually know that in so many other arenas we've been willing to just say, take a hike, like this isn't legitimate, but yet on this it's really held. For now, I think we have several questions. One of them actually relates to that. I'll sort of try to sort these in a logical order, and we'll spend 5 or 7 minutes here doing some Q&A. One of the things that came up was that I'm wondering, Gilles, this may be a question for you. You may have some thought about this as you've heard and probably felt a little vindicated by how much farmers have felt like we got screwed. Like, turns out we did. It feels like lots of other things have country of origin labeling required. Do you have a thought about why meat, why beef and meat in particular, Gilles, was like such a stronghold where people just let it go?
Well, it's because the dominant meatpacking cartel is global, right? You know, so they can leverage Brazilian, Australian beef against the U.S. market. They can make money by pretending. The thing that confuses consumers is the USDA stamp, inspection stamp. You know, it's that shield with red, white, and blue, and people look at that and say, "Oh, that must be American born and raised beef." Well, it's not. It's just an inspection stamp. Yeah, no, it's very important to us to get country of origin labeling back for
And that's
beef.
really a good point about like the meat industry in particular. The meat packing industry has so much power, and we heard both from you and well, actually from all three of you about the results of that kind of power and what it could have, both in the WTO but also in Congress itself. Tim, there's also a question about, I know in March, the USDA actually did change that voluntary labeling rule. Tim, do you want to tell us a little bit about what that means? And it seems like there is some confusion, so I'm glad this question came up about the voluntary labeling that Gilles was talking about versus mandatory cool.
Yeah, I've had people ask me that in the last couple days, actually. First of all, it amazes me, but nothing amazes me anymore. But it amazes me that we're still having this conversation after over 2 decades of organizing for transparency in the grocery store shelves, so we can choose U.S. beef raised by U.S. farmers. It just shows the undue corporate power of our democratic process. And the purpose of democracy, in my humble opinion, is to push back against that power, is to make that power accountable, and to support capitalism. And for capitalism to work, we need open, fair, and competitive markets. We need diversity, and we need competition. And when you have 4 meat packers controlling the entire marketplace, it's hard to have competition. You don't have competition. To your question, that was a little tangential. To your question, not only have we been organizing for 2 decades for mandatory country of origin labeling for meat, but we also were organizing to close this egregious loophole within voluntary country of origin labeling that allowed the meat packers to import meat from other countries around the world and repackage it and then put product to the United States on the meat that's on the grocery store shelves. It goes above and beyond what Gilles just talked about, the USDA stamp, which he's correct about. But it also just says product to the United States. They can put a big flag on it, even though it's imported. So the Biden administration, via his executive order on competition in the marketplace that came out in July of 2021, one of the action items was to close that loophole and to not allow them to label imported meat as product to the United States. That's a step in the right direction, but it's not nearly enough. And like I said, transparency and knowing where our food comes from is the first step in reinstating some semblance of competition in our marketplaces for producers and consumers alike.
Thanks so much for that clarification. I know I've been being asked that question a lot as well. Another question about Tim, this was specifically for Tim, about are there some key phrases that you think we can use to just talk to ordinary people about why this is happening or what we need to happen or why it's important? Are there some like things that have really touched with people that you think are worth us repeating to the public?
People ask how is the organization doing? And here at MRCC, we're doing well. We're really organizing hard. We're on the right side of history. We've got a lot of momentum behind us. And I think our movement in general for family farms out here is the movement is strong. The issue is getting past that brick wall of corporate power between what we know out here, and the history and the policies that we know and the solutions that we know out here, and then reflecting that via our elected representatives. And I put a really important emphasis on representative because they're representing us. And the vast majority of people out here agree with this. So what I would do is just have, continue to talk about this with our neighbors, with our family members. And then also, it's an election year. Make this an election issue. It's also a farm bill year, and we'll get to that as well. It needs to be a farm bill issue. These need to be issues that not only are we talking about out here, but are being, something's being done about at the democratic process and the policy level. Cool, I think, is just a symptom. I know cool is a symptom of a broader problem, and that broader problem is corporate control of our democratic process. And unfortunately, agriculture and meat production is a bad example of when corporations control the process, when they control the system, when they control the laws. They can also extract all the money. And the purpose of our democratic process is to ensure that we all have a fair shake out here. Right now, we don't. So we need cool. We need antitrust enforcement. And, we're fighting for cool and for cattle producers now. We were also fighting for hog producers in the 90s. And we were demanding from USDA and Congress and our administration at the time for them to do something to stop the corporate takeover of the hog industry. They didn't do any of it. What we were saying happened. And 90% of Missouri hog producers, 85% of U.S. hog producers were put out of business. And now 50% of the U.S. hog industry is controlled by 2 foreign multinational corporations out of China and Brazil. Brazil's JBS, which is also the biggest beef packer in the world. So these are all interconnected. We're fighting like hell out here, and join us, and get your neighbors and friends to join us as well.
So we'll just do 2 more questions. We have some questions. I will let folks know we will send out an email after this webinar that can also respond to some of your questions. Charles, if you want to include to us, which we'll also send out the document that you were talking about earlier that you had written, we would be happy to include that as well. But I'll just 2 quick questions left. A question about consumers. Like, we've been mostly talking about the farmer end of this today, but I think, Gilles, this is like a question to you, is do you think consumers would care? Do you think they would choose your beef? Do you think they would choose American beef? And why is that important?
Well, we should take them at their word. Poll after poll says that 90% of them says that they would like to know the origin of their beef. So, as I say, they're being confused by the product of USA label that Tim just talked about, and the USDA inspection stamp. They were also being confused when we did have country of origin labeling for beef, because the font that was required to say, born and raised in the USA was so small, you needed a magnifying glass to see it, right? But yeah, it's just very clear. Consumers should have the right to know the origin of the food they purchase, including beef, and they do have the right on all other food except for beef and pork. That was specifically rescinded. And again, as everybody said here, we ranchers and cattle feeders should have the right to a fair and competitive, honest market, and we don't have one. That's why, like your statistics, that we've lost what, 150,000 beef producers in just the last 3 years?
5 years, but yeah, and it doesn't include 2023, so it's worse than even that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for that. We're going to put up a slide. Thank you so much for so many questions. I think, again, we'll try to answer some of these in the email that we send out. But I just want to summarize. There are some things we can do right now. And again, this will also be in the email that we send out, these links. Number one, there's no reason why we heard from Charles directly why this is not a valid excuse for Congress to continue to not pass coal. And the Biden administration did take some action on the voluntary labeling. We need that to become mandatory. There is a petition that will be in the email that we hope you all will sign that is calling on Congress to do just that. There is a bill that has been introduced. It's a bipartisan bill called the American Beef Labeling Act. We want two things. We want our Congress people to support that bill, and we want the people who are currently considering the farm bill to put that bill into the farm bill. And there is a phone number on here, which will also be in the email that you can call your congressperson. That will take you to the switchboard and you will get connected to your congressperson. And of course, we want people to join our ongoing work at the Western Organization of Resource Councils and MRCC. And the sponsors of this event today are our two organizations and the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment. So as as all three of our incredible panelists have let us know, this is a long fight, and like these fights are going to need to go on. So we need to pass coal right now, this year, in the Farm Bill. We need to pass the American Beef Labeling Act, but we also know these are issues that are going to continue to come up in the future, and being part of organizing efforts that consistently engage in agriculture that support family farmers and consumers are critical to all of us. So just to do a short summary is, I think we've heard for real, this is not a valid argument anymore. Congress needs to move on. There's no excuses. We hope you will take a moment to sign the petition when we send out the email that states your position as such. Please call your congresspeople and tell them to support the American Beef Labeling Act and to put it in the Farm Bill. Stay in touch with our organizations. Please look for the email. The recording will also be included in the email. And I want to thank everyone who has joined us today. It was a great crowd of people. Especially, I know it's hard during the week for folks to really join this type of event. So I really support all of the people who joined us. I hope you've learned a lot. And a special thanks to Tim and Jill and Charles. That was an incredible amount of information that we can use to demand the labeling policies we know we need. Thank you all so much for joining.